Hello, and welcome back, my fellow Lovecraftians. It's been a while since we've read a story together. I was battling my own eldritch monster, sickness. Well, in the meantime, let me comfort you with the tales of a fact concerning the late Arthur Jermyn and his family. Life is a hideous thing, and from the background behind what we know of its pure demonical hints of truth, which make it sometimes 1,000-fold more hideous, science, already oppressive with its shocking revelations, will perhaps be the ultimate exterminator of our human species. In separate species we be, for its reserve of unguessed horrors could never be borne by mortal brains if loosened upon the world. If we knew what we are, we should do as Sir Arthur Jermyn did. And Arthur Jermyn soaked himself in oil and set fire to his clothing one night. No one placed the charred fragments in the urn or sent a memorial to him, who had been, for certain papers and a certain boxed object were found, which made men wish to forget. Some who knew him do not admit that he ever existed. Arthur Jermyn went out on the moor and burned himself after seeing the boxed object, which had come from Africa. It was the object, and not the peculiar person's appearance, which made him end his life. Many would have disliked to live if possessed of the peculiar features of Arthur Jermyn, but he had been a poet and a scholar, and had not minded learning what was in his blood, for his great-grandfather, Sir Robert Jermyn, B.T., had been an anthropologist of note, while his great-great-grandfather, Sir Wade Jermyn, was one of the earliest explorers of the Congo region, and had written crudely of its tribes, animals, and supposed antiques. Indeed, old Sir Wade had possessed an intellectual zeal amounting almost to a mania. His bizarre conjunctions of prehistoric white Congolese civilizations earning him much ridicule when his book, Observations in the Several Parts of Africa, was published in 1765. The fearless explorer had been placed in a madhouse at Huntingdon. Madness was in all the Germans, and people were glad there was not many of them. The line put forth no branches, and Arthur was the last of it. If he had not been, one could not say what he would have done when the object came. The Germans never seemed to look quite right. Something was amiss through Arthur was the worst, and his family portraits in Jermyn's house shewed fine faces enough before Sir Wade's time. Certainly, the madness began with Sir Wade. Those wild stories of Africa were at once the delight and terror of his few friends. It shrewd in his collections of trophies and specimens, which were not such as a normal man would accumulate and preserve, and appears strikingly in the oriental seclusion in which he kept his wife. The latter, he had said, was the daughter of a Portuguese trader whom he had met in Africa, and did not like English ways. She was an infant son born to Africa, had accompanied him back from the second and longest of his trips, and had gone with him on the third and last, never returning. No disposition had been violent and singular. During her brief stay at the German's house, she occupied a remote wing, and was waited on by her husband alone. Sir Wade was indeed most peculiar in his solitude for his family, for when he returned to Africa, he would permit no one to care for his young son, save a loathsome woman from Guinea. Upon coming back, after the death of Lady Jermyn, he himself assumed complete care of the boy, but it was the talk of Sir Wade, especially when in his cups, which chiefly led his friends to deem him mad. In a rational age, like the 18th century, it was unwise for man of learning to talk about wild sights and strange scenes from the Congo moon. Oh, Sir Jermyn, how did the gigantic walls and pillars of a forgotten city crumbling, and vines grown in a deep, damp, silent stone steps leading interminably down into the darkness of the abysmal treasure vaults. Inconveniently, also, there was catacombs. Especially was it unwise to rave of the living things that might haunt such a place. Of creatures, half of the jungle and half of the impious aged city, fabulous creatures, which even a Pliny might describe with skepticism, things that might have sprung up after the great apes have overrun the dying city, with the walls and the pillars and the vaults and the weird carvings. Yet, after he came home for the last time, Sir Wade would speak of such matters with a shuddering, uncanny zest, mostly like after his third glass of Knight's Head, boasting of what he had found in the jungle and of what he had dwelt among terrible ruins, known only to him. And finally, he had spoken of the living things in such a manner that he was taken to the madhouse. He had shown little regret when shut into the barred room in the Huntingdon, for his mind moved curiously ever since his son had commenced to grow out of infancy. He had liked his home less and less and less, till at last he had seemed to dread it. The Knight's Head had been his headquarters, and when he was confined, he expressed some vague gratitude, as if for protection. 3 years later, he died. Wade Jermyn's son Philip was a highly peculiar person. Despite a strong physical resemblance to his father, his appearance and conduct were in many particular ways so coarse that he was universally shunned. Though he did not inherit the madness which was feared by some, he was densely stupid and given to brief periods of uncontrollable violence. In frame, he was small but intensely powerful, and was of incredible agility. 12 years after succeeding to his title, he married the daughter of his gamekeeper, a person said to be a gypsy extraction, but before his son was born, joined the Navy as a common sailor, completing the general disgust which his habits and messalines had begun. After the close of the American War, he was heard of a sailor of a merchantman on the African trade, having a kind of reputation for feats of strength and climbing, but finally disappearing one night as the ship lay off in the Congo coast. And the son of Sir Philip Jermyn, the now accepted family, peculiar, took a strange and fatal turn. Tall and fairly handsome, with a sort of weird Eastern grace despite certain slight oddities of proportions, Robert Jermyn began life as a scholar and investigator. It was he who first studied scientifically the vast collection of relics which had made his grandfather mad, and brought from Africa, and who made the family name as a celebrated in ethnology and in exploration. In 1815, Sir Robert married a daughter of the 7th Viscount Brighthelm, and was substantially blessed with 3 children, the eldest and the youngest of whom were never publicly seen on account of deformities in mind and body. Saddened by these family misfortunes, the scientists sought relief in work, and made 2 long expeditions in the interior of Africa. In 1849, his second son Neville, a singular repellent person who had seemed to combine the surliness of Philip Jermyn with the haunter of the Brighthelms, ran away with a vulgar dancer, but was pardoned upon his return in the following year. He came back to Jermyn's house a widower with an infant son, Alfred, who was one day to be the father of Arthur Jermyn. Friends said that it was a series of griefs which unhinged the minds of Sir Robert Jermyn, yet it was probably merely a bit of African folklore which caused the disaster. The elderly scholar had been collecting legends of the Onga tribes near the field of his grandfather's and his own explorations, hoping in some way to account for Sir Wade's wild tales of a lost city peopled by strange hybrid creatures. A certain consistency in this was believing that certain legends of the gray city of white apes ruled by a white god might prove valuable to the ethologist. In the conversation, he probably supplied many additional details, the nature which will never be known, since a hideous series of tragedies suddenly burst into being. Poor Sir Robert Jermyn emerged from his library. He left behind the strangled corpse of the explorer, and before he could be restrained, had put an end to all 3 of his children. Oh, Sir Alfred Jermyn was a baronet before his 4th birthday, and we refused to understand the strangled corpse or Neville. And then a son. Oh my god. But Neville Jermyn did die in a successful defense of his own 2-year-old son, which apparently been included in the old man's madly murderous scheme. Sir Robert himself, after repeated attempts at suicide and stubborn refusal to utter any articulate sound, died of apoplexy in the 2nd year of his confinement. Sir Alfred Jermyn was a baronet before his 4th birthday, but his taste never matched his title. At 20, he had joined a band of music hall performers, and at 36, had deserted his wife and child to travel with an inherent American circus. His end was very revolting. Among the animals in the exhibition which he traveled was a huge bull gorilla of lighter, cooler than the average, a surprisingly tractable beast of much popularity with the performers. With the gorilla, Arthur Jermyn was singularly fascinated, and on many occasions the two would eye each other for long periods through the intervening bars. Eventually, Jermyn asked the obtainer of permission to train the animal, astonishing audience and fellow performers alike with his success. One morning in Chicago, as the gorilla and Arthur Jermyn were rehearsing an exceedingly clever boxing match, the former delivered a blow of more than usual force, hurting the body and dignity of the amateur trainer. Of what following members of the greatest show on earth do not like to speak. They did not expect to hear Sir Arthur Jermyn emit a shrill, inhuman scream, or to see him seize Kitty. Sit down, Kitty. Sit down. Which will never be known, since a hideous series of tragedies suddenly burst into being when Sir Robert Which will never be known, since a hideous series of tragedies suddenly burst into being. When Sir Robert Jermyn emerged from his library, he left behind the strangled corpse of the explorer, and, before he could be restrained, had put an end to all three of his children, the two who were never seen, and the son who had run away. Neville Jermyn died in the successful defense of his own 2-year-old son, who had apparently been included in the old man's madly murderous scheme. Sir Robert himself, after repeated attempts at suicide and a stubborn refusal to utter any articulate sound, died of apoplexy in the 2nd year of confinement. Sir Arthur Jermyn, the surviving son, was a baronet before his 4th birthday, but his taste never matched his title. At 20, he had joined a band of music hall performers, and at 36, had deserted his wife and child to travel with an inherent American circus. His end was very revolting. Among the animals in the exhibition he traveled with was a huge bull gorilla of lighter color than the average, a surprisingly trackable beast of much popularity with the performers. When the gorilla Arthur Jermyn was fascinated by, on many accounts, there was occasions the two would eye each other for long periods of time through the intervening bars. Eventually, Jermyn asked the obtained permission to train the animal, astonishing audiences and fellow performers alike with his success. One morning in Chicago, as the gorilla and Arthur Jermyn were rehearsing an exceedingly clever boxing match, the former delivered a blow of more than usual force, hurting both the body and the dignity of the amateur trainer. Of what followed, members of the greatest show on earth do not like to speak. They did not expect to hear Sir Arthur Jermyn emit a shrill, inhuman scream, or to see him seize his clumsy antagonist with both hands, dash it to the floor of the cage, and bite fiendishly at its hairy throat. The gorilla was off its guard, but not for long, and before anything could be done by the regular trainer, the body which had belonged to a baronet was past recognition. Chapter 2. Arthur Jermyn was the son of Sir Arthur Jermyn and a music hall singer of unknown origin. When the husband and father deserted his family, the mother took the child to Jermyn's house, where there was none left to objectify her presence. She was not without notation of what a nobleman's dignity should be, and saw to it that her son received the best education which limited money could provide. The family's resources were now sadly slender, and Jermyn's house had fallen into woeful despair, but young Arthur loved the old edifice and all of its contents. He was not like any other Jermyns who had ever lived, for he was a poet and a dreamer. Some of the neighboring families, who had heard tales of old Sir Wade Jermyn's unseen Portuguese wife, declared that her Latin blood must be shewing itself, but most persons merely sneered at his sensitiveness to beauty, attributing it to the music-hall mother, who had socially unrecognized the poetic delicacy of Arthur Jermyn, and was more remarkable because of his uncouth personal appearance. Most other Jermyns had possessed a subtly odd and repellent cast, but Arthur's case was very striking. It was hard to say what he resembled, but his expression, his facial angle, and the length of his arms gave a thrill of repulsion to those who met him for the first time. It was the mind and character of Arthur Jermyn which atoned for his aspects. Gifted and learned, he took highest honors at Oxford, and seemed likely to redeem the intellectual fame of his family, Though of poetic rather than scientist temperament, he planned to continue the work of his forefathers in the African anthology and antiques, utilizing the truly wonderful thought of strange collections of Sir Wade. With his fancied mind, he thought often of the prehistoric civilizations in which the mad explorer had so implicitly believed in, and would wave tale after tale about the silent jungle city mentioned in the latter widower's notes, and paragraphs for the nebulous utterances concerning a nameless, unsuspected race of jungle hybrids. He had a peculiar feeling of mingled terror and attraction, speculating on the possible basis of such a fancy, and seeking to obtain light among the more recent gleaned by his great-grandfather and Samuel Seton amongst the Ongas. In 1911, after the death of his mother, Sir Arthur Jermyn determined to pursue his investigation to the utmost extent. Selling a portion of his estate to obtain the required money, he outfitted an expedition and sailed all the way to Africa. Now, once his arrangement with the Belgian authorities for a party of guides, he spent a year in the Onga and Kalari country, finding data beyond the highest of his expectations. Among the colliers was an aged chief called Mulwan, who possessed not only a highly retentive memory, but a singular degree of intelligence and interest in old legends. This ancient confirmed every tale which Jermyn had heard, adding his own account of the stone city and the white ape as it had been told to him. According to Mulwan, the great city and hybrid creatures were no more, having been annihilated by the warlike Nimbrotskos years ago. The tribe, after destroying most of its innocents and killing the live beings, had carried off the stuffed goddesses which had been the object of their quest. The white ape goddess, which had the strange beings worshipped and which was held by the Congo's traditions to be the form of one who had reigned as a princess among those beings. Just what the white ape-like creatures could have been, Mulwan had no idea. He thought they were builders of the ruined city. Jermyn could form no conjecture, but by close questioning, obtained a very picturesque legend of a stuffed goddess. The ape princess, it was said, became the consort of the great white god who had come out of the west. For a long time they had reigned over the city together, but when they had a son, all three went away. Later the god and the princess had returned, and upon the death of the princess, her divine husband had mummified the body and enshrined it in the vast house of stone where it was worshipped. Then he had departed alone. The legend here seemed to be present of three variations. According to one of the nothing further happened, save the stuffed goddess became a symbol of supremacy for whatever tribe might possess it. It was for the reason that the Nimbwangas carried it off. A second story told of the god's return and death at the feet of his enshrined wife. A third told of the return of the son, grown to manhood or apehood or godhood, as the case might be, yet unconscious of his identity. Surely the imagination had made the most of whatever events might lie behind the extravagant legendary. Of the reality of the jungle city, described by old Sir Wade, Arthur Jermyn had no further doubt, and was hardly astonished when, early in 1912, he came upon what was left of it. Its size must have been exaggerate, yet the stones lying about proved that it was no mere village. Unfortunately, no carvings could be found, and the small size of the expedition prevented further exploration. Well, that might be the options. We could crawl towards a clearing of one visible passageway that seemed to lead down into the system of vaults, which Sir Wade had mentioned. The white apes and the stuffed goddess were discussed with all the native chiefs in the region and its remains for the European to improve on the data offered by old Monwan in Verken. For a European to be traveling down to the Belgians aiding at a trading post on the Congo, he believed that he would not only locate but obtain the stuffed goddess of which he had vaguely heard, since the once mighty Nambuagwas were now submissive servants of King Albert's government, and with but little persuasion could be induced to part with the gruesome deity they had carried off when Jermyn sailed from England. Therefore, it was the exultant probability that he would, within a few months, receive a princess ethnological relic, confirming the wildest of his great-great-great-grandfather's narratives. That is, the wildest which he had ever heard. Countrymen near Jermyn's house had perhaps heard wilder tales handed down from ancestors who had listened to Sir Wade around the tables of the Knight's Head. Arthur Jermyn waited very patiently for the expected box from Mr. Werth, meanwhile studying with increased diligence the manuscripts left by his mad ancestor. He began to feel closely akin to Sir Wade, and to seek relics of the latter personal life in England as well as of his African exploits. Oral accounts of the mysterious and secluded wife had been numerous, but not tangible. Prompted or permitted such an efficient and dedicated and decided husband into insanity was the prime cause. His great-great-great-grandmother, he recalled, was said to have been the daughter of a Portuguese trader in Africa. No doubt her practical heritage and superficial knowledge of the dark continent had caused her to flout Sir Wade's talk of the interior, a thing which such a man would not be likely to forgive. She had died in Africa, perhaps dragged thither by a husband determined to prove what he had told, but as Jermyn indulged in these reflections, he could not but smile at their futility. A century and a half after the death of both of his strange progenitors, in June 1913, a letter arrived from Mr. Vanham telling of the finding of the stuffed goddess. It was, the Belgian averred, a most extraordinary object, an object quite beyond the power of a layman to classify. Whether it was human or simian, only a scientist could determine, and the process of determination be greatly hampered by its imperfect condition. Time and the Congo climate are not kind to mummies, especially when their preparation is as amateurish as seemed by the case here. Around the creature's neck had been found a golden chain bearing an empty locket on which the armorial designs, no doubt, some hapless traveler's keepsake, taken by the Nambagas and hung up upon the goddess as a charm. In the commenting on the contour of the mummy's face, Mr. Perv suggested whimsical comparison, or rather expressed a humorous wonder just how it would strike his correspondent, but was too much interested scientifically to waste many words in levity. The stuffed goddess, he wrote, would arrive duly packed about a month after the letter. The boxed object was delivered at Jermyn's house on the afternoon of August 3rd, 1913, being conveyed immediately to the large chamber which housed the collection of African specimens, as arranged by Sir Robert and Arthur. What ensured can be best gathered from the tales of the servants and from things and papers later examined. On the various tales, that the aged Solomons and family butler is most ample and coherent. According to this trustworthy man, Sir Arthur Jermyn dismissed everyone, and I mean everyone, from the room before opening the box, though the instant sound of hammer and chisel shewn that he did not delay the operation. Nothing was heard for some time. Just how long, Solomons cannot exactly estimate, but it was less than a quarter of an hour later that the horrible scream, undoubtedly in Jermyn's voice, was heard. Immediately after Jermyn emerged from the room, rushing frantically towards the front of the house, as if pursued by some hideous enemy, the expression on his face, a face ghastly enough in response, was beyond description. When near the front door, he seemed to think of something, and turned back in his flight, finally disappearing down the stairs to the cellar. The servants were utterly dumbfounded, and watched at the head of the stairs, but their master did not return. A smell of oil was all that came up from the regions below. After dark, a rattling was heard at the door leading from the cellar into the courtyard, and a stable boy saw Arthur Jermyn glistening from head to foot with oil and redolent of that fluid, steal furtively out and vanish in the black moor surrounding the house. Then, in an exhalation of supreme horror, everyone saw the end. A spark appeared on the moor, a flame arose, and a pillar of human fire reached to the heavens. The house of Jermyn no longer existed. The reason why Arthur Jermyn charred fragments were not collected and buried lies in what found afterwards, principally the thing in the box. The stuffed goddess was a nauseous sight, withered and eaten away, but it was clearly a mummified white ape of some unknown species, less hairy than any recorded variety, and infinitely nearer mankind. Quite shockingly, so detailed descriptions would be rather unpleasant, but two salient particulars must be told, for they fit in revolting with certain notes of Sir Wade Jermyn's African expeditions, and with the Congolese legends of the White God and the Eight Princess. The two particulars in question are these. The arms of the golden locket about the creature's neck were the Jermyn's arms, and the jocose suggestions of Mount Vero about a certain resemblance connected to the shriveled face applied with a vivid, ghastly, and unnatural horror to none other than the sensitive Arthur Jermyn's great-great-grandson of Sir Wade Jermyn's, and an unknown wife. Members of the Royal Anthropological Institute burned the thing and threw the locket into a well, and some of them do not admit that Arthur Jermyn ever existed. Such concludes the end of our story. I was not expecting several plot twists. The fact that one of the Jermys killed his own family, the build-up between the heritage at first I felt was just like extra world building, as we all know Lovecraft is famous for. But it actually did matter. Through generation and generation, they didn't know what was calling them. The fact that he died by the monkey, the fact that they wanted to go back was because they were descendant from gods. Their own heritage was what they were chasing the whole time. That would be enough to drive any man insane. Honestly, my favorite part was the unexpected theories that you can draw from this. Several times I had to pause and reread lines. The story was almost hard to tell because my brain was just rattling so many different theories. Could you leave some of yours below and tell me, would you give your mind to madness if you found your ancestor's body and knew that your whole family's lineage was dedicated to that and that alone? Your mission is over, but what eldritch horror lies between the god and the princess I still cannot uncover in my mind. For the princess was found, but the god never was. Until next time, my Lovecraftians. Bye-bye.